Good morning. My name is Rick Berkman. As a member of AJC's Executive Council, I'm delighted to welcome you this morning to the AJC University session. Anti-Semitism has been called the world's oldest hatred. Dating back to ancient times, anti-Jewish ideas, actions, and programs have never gone out of fashion. To be sure, the particular themes and alleged reasons for hatred and suspicion of Jews has shifted widely over time. In pagan Greece and Rome, Jews were charged with lack of patriotism for refusing to worship the local idols. With the emergence of Christianity, Jews were condemned as Christ killers, and by the Middle Ages they were stereotyped as unscrupulous and exploitive moneylenders. The onset of modernity brought a new charge. Jews could not be trusted as citizens because of their clannishness. Racial anti-Semitism, a product of the 19th century, led to the Nazi movement and the Holocaust. And today, strident criticism of Israel and Zionism is often little more than a disguise for anti-Semitism. In Europe, there was once a widespread view that the post-World War II revelations of the annihilation of 6 million Jews would put an end, once and for all, to the scourge of anti-Semitism. But in recent years, such optimism has become hard to defend. Violent attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, proposals in some countries to ban central Jewish religious practices, and anti-Jewish sentiments expressed by the leaders of both the right and the left-wing political parties give grave grounds for concern. To discuss the roots of this phenomenon and suggest what might be done about it, we have a distinguished panel. Hanif Bali, a member of the Swedish Parliament, Gillian Merron, Chief Executive of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, our Director of AJC Europe and AJC Paris, and Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Commissioner's Coordinator on Combating Anti-Semitism. Our moderator is Rabbi Andrew Baker, AJC Director of International Jewish Affairs, and also the personal representative on combating anti-Semitism of the chair in office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. Please join me in giving our distinguished panel a big round of applause. And looking forward to it.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming out this morning. There is, probably known to most of you, an old, at this point rather stale joke in the Jewish world, the telegram that gets sent to Jewish communities, reading very tersely, "Start worrying now, details to follow." We're here to talk about the details. I think you're all aware of the subject. There are really still many reasons to be alarmed, but also a lot of people working on the ground to address the problem. And I think with the people we have here today, you'll get a real picture both of what the problem is, and again, in some detail, but also what are the strategies, what are the efforts undertaken by Jewish communities, by others in society, by institutions in Europe to really address these problems. We're not going to eliminate anti-Semitism, but surely we're all committed to doing whatever we can to reduce it so it is no longer something that really threatens the very well-being, the life, the future of Jews in Europe. To start, I want to turn first to Simone, coming here from Paris. As everyone knows, France represents the largest Jewish community in Europe. Certainly, it's been the subject of much attention over the last decade in terms of surge in anti-Semitic incidents, real questions of physical security, not only terrorist threats, but those threats actualized in the murder and deaths of Jews in France. We've seen anecdotally, but we also know from opinion research, many Jews in France themselves have begun to question their own future. The real issue of security has become paramount. The government has responded to this. Ultimately, it mobilized the military after the attacks in the kosher market at the same time as the attacks on the offices of Charlie Hebdo, a sense that maybe at last the French Jewish community was understood by the government itself to be a target, to be a real threat. It came forward. As we'd seen, the military literally was mobilized to protect Jewish schools, synagogues, other institutions. But we also have seen how Jews now share in being targets with French society at large. In a way, there's the solidarity, and perhaps you can say something more about that, Simone, but it also means that those efforts to protect are spread even more thin. And so the Jewish community, where they've seen a real reduction in incidents, I think are braced maybe for an increase again. So Simone, how do you see the situation? How would you describe it today, now in Paris and elsewhere in France? And as you do this, can you speak also about the French system? In other words, this official secularity, laïcité, which has often clouded the ability to really identify the perpetrators of anti-Semitic incidents, to focus on perhaps where the problem lies more specifically.
Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Do you have 2 or 3 hours ahead of you? In your question, right from the beginning, I would say there's something interesting that you said, because it is absolutely right that it started, the fact that the Jewish community had to be protected, and now that the society at large has to be protected, is very much the essence of something we have said for a very long time, that, and that people say like that, but it actually is true. It starts with the Jews, it doesn't end there. So the way it reflects in this, this also, of course, reflects itself in the security situation. So you're absolutely right. In 2015, after the attacks of Charlie Hebdo and the Hypercacher, the government decided to create, to put in place what is called l'Opération Sentinelle, which put 10,000 soldiers on the ground to protect Jewish community sites, basically sensitive sites. We knew right from the beginning that this was not tenable, that it was impossible to keep up that way for a long time. When the other terrorist attacks happened in November of 2015, and Nice, of course, etc., every single time it had to be adapted, which of course then meant that to some extent the Jewish community was a little nervous about the fact that it would lose some of its security aspects. So today what happened is that in very close consultation with the Jewish community and the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, and the police, they look at the different sites, the Jewish community sites, plus everything else that needs to be protected, from airports to sensitive sites to individuals who are under threat in French society, and they try to adapt. And it really happens on a constant basis, and it's a very fluid process. So we have indeed reduced the number of army, of soldiers. We're now not at 10,000 anymore, we're at 7,000, but still, they're still there. The difference now is that they're not static, meaning that you would have in front of synagogues before, you would have soldiers standing before. This is not the case anymore. Now you will have soldiers who are moving, who are patrolling, and who are going to who are now responsible for 7, 8, 9 different sites. The Jewish community is still pretty content, pretty happy about the way this is happening. Again, we have very, very close cooperation. We have the security, the SPCG, which is the protection service of the Jewish community, which is really basically talking to police on every single day basis. But apart from this, it has also allowed the Jewish community to take responsibility for themselves, which basically means that they have looked into what is needed in terms from a security perspective, and have asked the government to put in place cameras, to put in place, to give training, to really cooperate on an everyday basis. We have also put in place programs which are really interesting in, for example, teacher and parents, where parents are being trained on security. Parents know how to react when they see an individual, something that really 5, 6, 7 years ago didn't exist in France. to come to your second part of the question, I'll try and remain as short as possible. Yes, it's been a major problem, the fact that, that we don't have ethnical statistics in France, which basically prevents us from looking into where anti-Semitism actually comes from. When you ask a public French official and you speak about anti-Semitism and you have, let's say, 800 anti-Semitic acts, and you ask them where do they come from, who commits those acts, they will tell you, we can't tell you, we don't know. It's a major issue, and it's a major problem. So one way of preventing this, of getting around this, we at AJC have done quite a little bit of work. We did two major studies in France, which don't look at violence, but look at public opinion on anti-Semitism. The first one was a quantitative study that we did 2 years ago, and where we saw that anti-Semitism in French public opinion was relatively high, but that it was in particular coming from three groups. It's certainly not surprising to many of you. The first group was the far right. The second group was the far left, in a different way of expressing anti-Semitism, mostly related to Israel, people who believe that there is a Zionist conspiracy. And then there was a third group that was the Muslim community. It was the first time this had ever been done, specifically looking at the Muslim community and the fact and the degree of which there was anti-Semitism. Now, to the American audience, this doesn't sound revolutionary. In France, this was a major revolution. The fact of being able to pinpoint to the fact that anti-Semitism was coming partly from the Muslim community was a revolution, and it has entirely changed the debate.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to turn to Hanif. Hanif, you are here from Sweden. You came to Sweden as a young boy from the Muslim world, and now you are active in the Swedish-Israeli relations, the Friendship Society. We've been very concerned about this growth of anti-Semitism, as Simone said, in part coming from Arab and Muslim communities, but a real alarm today about the surge of immigrants, migrants, refugees coming from the Arab world, from North Africa. Much attention is focused on Germany. It's well known, over 1 million refugees and migrants have arrived last year. Maybe getting less attention is the fact that there's a significant number that have come to Sweden. Some 160,000, I believe, which per capita really represents the largest number in any of these European countries. The concerns are real, at least on the part of Jewish communities. Again, many of the incidents of anti-Semitism in Sweden, particularly in the southern city of Malmö, seem to be coming from parts of the immigrant Muslim Arab communities. Here too, perhaps like France, maybe there's not clear data showing this objectively, whether that's because government officials don't want to see it or whether it's not known, that may be another question. We also have an environment in Sweden, I think, which you are surely sensitive to. There's a very strongly critical view of Israel on the part of the government itself, even a real tension between the foreign minister of Sweden, as we saw on a visit to Israel in the Middle East, and the state of Israel, so that anti-Israel animus that sometimes becomes a form of anti-Semitism also looms out there in Sweden. And now, again, confronting these large numbers of migrants, what do you see as, in a way, the concerns of the Jewish community? How are they recognized? What can you do in your role, really, as a unique figure in speaking to these issues to try and clarify and address this situation?
So when it came 160,000, that was the largest per capita intake of asylum seekers ever recorded in the industrialized world. So so the listeners here can relate. The problems in Malmö and the problems in Sweden of anti-Semitism from the immigrant groups that are coming in, this is not the same groups we're talking about. These are old sins. These are immigrant populations that came 10, 15 years ago in much smaller numbers, but still high compared to in percentage, when Germany took in 1 million, that's a normal year for us per capita. So, what we see now, what I see in front of me is this is not going to, the Syrian population and the Afghani population that has come in, there's nothing indicating that these are going to be, less problems with the clashes of values that are coming. And one of my main points that I try to enforce is we have an erosion in the entire Western world, but in Sweden specifically, of what is racism and what is anti-Semitism. The moral and intellectual foundations of what is racism and what is anti-Semitism has been eroded. Now, it used to be, for me, that racism was if you define a person's moral or personal traits and define it to his ethnicity. That used to be, but this definition has been eroded. Now it's kind of, you see who's at the top, who is white, who makes money, who doesn't. The definitions of racism is, constantly is changing. And therefore, in that context, the rich, or wealthy, well-educated white Jew could not, are defined of somebody who cannot be, a subject of racism with that ideology. And this is a huge problem that we're seeing. And this is also being mixed in with anti-Israel sentiment. There's a coalition between the left and a lot of anti-Semitic, immigrants, a coalition of where they find a common ground in their hatred against Israel. And this, in Malmö, it started with a boycott of a tennis game between Israel and Sweden. It started with that, with riots, and you saw left politicians pandering to the anti-Israel sentiment, which has a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Semitic foundation, and this is the problem we're seeing in Sweden is mainly because they didn't address this issue as anti-Semitism. They ignored the issue of security for the Jewish population, and now we have areas or cities in Sweden where you can't freely show that you are a Jew, show wear the Star of David and wear a kippah. So one thing that I'm trying to do is some form of both create a more intellectual or moral foundation of what is racism and anti-Semitism, but also showing that it is not a natural phenomena that you have to be anti-Semitic. It is in some sense that even with your background, you have the choice of stopping the hate and opening your mind to new people. And also, if you demand that Islamophobia is a problem, you have to accept that anti-Semitism is a problem too. These both ideas have their have a same foundation in that it ascribes moral and personal traits to a person's lineage or a person's choice of religion. So this is one of the issues that I'm working with and try to in some form transfer to the public opinion.
Hanif, thank you. I want to turn to Gillian. Gillian, you come here, you've been active in government, but now you're the executive director, the CEO of the Board of Deputies, the umbrella organization of British Jewry. For many elsewhere in Europe, people, Jewish communities, governments even, have looked to the UK and to the security model that you have really as something to be emulated. The Community Security Trust in the UK works closely with police and government authorities, not only from collecting data, but identifying security concerns, terrorist threats, and the like. Share perhaps with us a little bit of what have become the best practices of the UK, how you think they have really provided this sense of security. Is it still as strong as perhaps some people from outside have felt in light of still, most recently now, new terrorist attacks in the UK? How are British Jews feeling and reacting to this?
Well, let me start with the last point. Britain is a great place to be a Jew. I'm in no doubt about that, and that's the overall feeling. And I have to add, we are far from complacent. And in being far from complacent, I'd emphasise to you it's not just about how the reality is about attacks, abuse, incidents of anti-Semitism, it's also how people feel. And of course, in these current times, we feel uneasy. I so well remember the attacks in Paris and the effect that had on us. You know, we are very geographically, not just geographically close to France, but we feel very close to our French colleagues. And so that really resonated with us. So we felt that. In terms of the more positive aspects that you referred to, Andy, I think that the community kind of learned many years ago, and certainly if you go back to the 1930s, when it was probably a bit easier to work out where your enemy was coming from. I think the community felt the need to be proactive in defending itself. And in the early 1990s, as you referred to quite rightly, the Community Security Trust was born as a response to that. And I'd absolutely pay tribute to the volunteers, the professionals in the Community Security Trust who work night and day in conjunction, very close conjunction with all of our security and police services. And neither side could do it without the other, and I think it's a wonderful model in that respect. But I would pay tribute, as I say, to those who are involved, and the community is very reassured by that and supports it very much. I would also add that the amount of state funding we've had has undoubtedly been a great support, and the state funding from the government of late has been very much directed to protecting our community institutions, schools and other places. And I am reminded that whilst my opening comments were about it's a great place to be a Jew, I think we get used to things and we forget. Whenever somebody who's not Jewish approaches our office, they always comment to me, do I not notice the fact there's a airlock door and security outside, etc., etc. And the reality is, no, I don't notice it anymore, which is a bit of a sad reflection. But that isn't usual in Britain. It's a fact. It's not usual in Britain when you go to a school to find fences and to find fences and guards. That is not normal, but it is for a Jewish school. So I fear we get a bit used to things. But certainly the funding from the government has been extremely welcome and has made us feel more secure. And the other area that I'd emphasise to friends here is what's really helped us, and Hanif talked about the struggle of people understanding what we're even talking about when we talk about anti-Semitism. And what's really helped us of late is the adoption of the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism, because it gives us a basis, it gives us a focus. And as a community, it allows us to say to local authorities, to councils, to political parties, to any grouping indeed, why don't you adopt this definition? Why don't you work to it And then you've always got a guide, particularly when people are talking about Israel, because that's the area that a number hide behind, I believe. And I'm sure, well, I can tell, the panel, we would all agree. That's a very nice place if you want to hide behind, if you are an anti-Semite or have those tendencies. Just have a bit of a go at Israel, because that's okay. Well, it's not okay when you are criticising and undermining its fundamental right to exist and the reason that it's there. So the working definition has been a huge assistance, and we have more to do on that.
Yeah, and let me say a bit. I wanted to get into this, but we've addressed it now. So the working definition of anti-Semitism has its origins initially developed by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia back in 2004, 2005. Some of you heard, some of us here at AJC were very much involved at the time. At that time, the EUMC did its first study of anti-Semitism in the then 15 EU member states. It turned out that while they had monitors to do this, half of them had no definition of anti-Semitism, and those that did, there were no two definitions that were the same, which became really an opening to say, let's discuss and develop a comprehensive definition, one that can be used throughout the EU states. A definition that explains anti-Semitism in its traditional forms, hatred toward Jews, prejudice, discrimination, but also elaborates on other aspects that may not be as well known. Conspiracy theories about Jews, Holocaust denial, and as Gillian said, anti-Semitism as it relates to the state of Israel. When Israel's demonized, when its very existence is called into question, when you draw analogies to Israel drawing from, say, the Nazi treatment, the definition would say this isn't criticism, this is a form of anti-Semitism. It had a certain life in this European Monitoring Center, which later was disbanded and taken over by a larger EU agency. And there have been efforts throughout to try to get this definition employed by governments, as Gillian said, used by those who monitor, but those who have to identify hate crimes, police, prosecutors, and judges. And what was quite notable, and it was identified last evening, if people were at and recall specifically President Iohannis of Romania, how when Romania served as the chair of IHRA, this is what Gillian mentioned, this umbrella organization focused on Holocaust remembrance, it managed to secure the adoption by IHRA of essentially this same definition. And with that, you've had a number of governments that have said, we will now adopt this definition for use. The UK is one of them. That's what Gillian highlighted. We've seen also the government of Austria adopting this. We've seen it being put into use for prosecutor training, police training in the UK and Austria, now in Germany. It became close to adopted by the OSCE, which 57 countries, all of Europe, the US, Canada, all of the former Soviet Union, it makes decisions by consensus. So at the end of the day, you had 56 of 57 countries willing to agree to adopt it, but because you didn't have that 57th, that was the Russian Federation, by the way, it couldn't succeed, but perhaps it will this year. But let me turn now to Katharina. Katharina, appreciate you're back again. We're going to make this an annual affair for you. When you joined us last year, you were relatively new on the job as this first EU coordinator focused on anti-Semitism, but now you've had the benefit of a year. You've been traveling around the EU, meeting with Jewish communities. I know you have a more firsthand feel now for what they're feeling and experiencing. I'd love if you could share some of that with us. But as we've also referenced the working definition, what's quite notable, and I hope you'll say a few words about this as well, only this last week, the European Parliament in Brussels adopted a resolution on combating anti-Semitism, and notable in the various points of that resolution was a call on the EU governments, EU institutions, to employ the working definition. So please share some of these things with us now.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to be back here. Okay.
Sorry. I'm the only one.
Okay. Sorry about that. So with regards to the analysis of the situation for Jewish communities across Europe, I can say that the accounts that we just heard very much are congruent with what I've heard by traveling and meeting Jewish communities in Western Europe. We have, with regards to the Central and Eastern European countries, a slightly different situation. I was recently in Poland. I visited the Jewish Community Center. It's a glass building in the middle of Warsaw, no security. You just walk in. You have your bagel and your coffee there, and this is perfectly normal. So while we see in Western Europe a certain degree of fear and also doubt about the future, and I think, if I have to be honest, this is the thing that drives me most, is the fact that 72 years after the Shoah, we have indeed Jews in Europe who question their future in Europe. This is a disaster, and it's also a great failure of European governments and also the European Union. So therefore, there is a clear, and I think we've seen that change after the attacks in 2015, a clear political will to address this in the different forms and the different fields that we can do it. On the one side, with regards to the immediate reaction, which is law enforcement. For example, we have good legislation in place across Europe, but it needs to be applied, which means policemen, prosecutors, judges have to be trained. And this training needs to be done. We now are in support of the member states to ensure that they increase their training on hate crime, understanding hate crime, and also hate speech on the basis of this European legislation, and have, for example, now issued a call for proposals to financially support the member states in better educating their law enforcement authorities. This is one aspect. The other aspect is the preventive arm, where we need to work much better to ensure, on the one side, a better understanding about the Shoah, about the Holocaust, and what it meant in the creation of post-war Europe, in the creation of the democracies that we see now, of our values, that are being so heavily attacked now from the side of the terrorists and radical Islamists. This is one thing we I think really need to understand better, and to some degree it's also a thermometer or a litmus test. If someone has understood the role of the Holocaust for the democratization process, post-war democratization process in Europe, there are no other issues with regards to integration. He will not doubt the fact that men and women are equal, that you need a rule of law. So I think that is important when we look at our education system, and we work closely with the member states of the EU because education is essentially their responsibility. The Director General of our Education Department this year went to the March of the Living to have a debate in Auschwitz with the ministers of education of the EU member states about how to improve education on the Holocaust. Some really because of the situation in multicultural classrooms, and because there have been cases of teachers being physically attacked when they start talking about the Holocaust under the pretext of saying, well, Israel is doing the same in Gaza. they rather turn the page and say, let's turn to the 50s. Yeah? So in order to avoid this, we need training for teachers to address, on the one side, their own biases, but on the other side also to really equip them with arguments and resilience in multicultural classrooms. So we try to have this broad approach, and we try to work through the existing structures that there are with the member states, because we think that they are the most efficient and effective ones. With regards to the working definition, I think it is indeed a very good development that we have seen. And I remember when we had the first meeting just after I was appointed as coordinator, we called a meeting in Prague with the special envoys, and Andy was there as well. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was represented, and then some of the national special envoys on anti-Semitism. And the elephant in the room was really, what are we going to do with this working definition? Because it had been lingering there with no official recognition. We had received repeated calls from the Jewish community to do something with it. And so a reflection process was started that had a very short life, because it ended already in May after half a year with the adoption by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And I think this process is now ongoing and has, from the international level, gone to the fact that national governments are adopting it. But of course, the most important issue is that they also apply it. So it's a non-legally binding guidance tool as to what is anti-Semitism, but it means that police, prosecutors, judges need to know what it actually entails, and how you distinguish anti-Semitism, for example, from anti-Zionism, legitimate criticism of Israel like that towards other countries cannot be considered anti-Semitic, but if it is about the self-determination of the Jewish people or about the right of existence of the State of Israel, it is clearly anti-Semitic. And that, with this definition, can be said and can be and gives a good basis on the various levels, also on the levels of civil society. Then I'm very pleased to see that the European Parliament has indeed last week adopted a resolution on anti-Semitism, where it calls for a lot of issues, including, for example, the appointment of national special envoys, of better education, facilities, material, better equipment of teachers. Also, with regards to security, it is very clear, and we advocate for that with the member states, because again, it's a responsibility of the member states to ensure the security of their citizens, and the burden of this security must not be borne by the Jewish communities. So it's the only community in Europe where there is a doubt. All other communities, when there's a security issue, it's very clear that the state is responsible. So again, this is this one issue that is also part of this resolution. And then the resolution calls the EU member states, its agencies, and the EU institution, EU institutions, its agencies, and the EU member states to adopt and to apply this working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which gives a good basis, I think, for all those working in the fight against anti-Semitism to refer to this adoption by the elected body on the highest European level when it comes to the application of this definition in the various fields on national level, including, of course, the adoption by national governments. So I think there has been a significant progress made in the last year and a half to enable those who want to prevent and fight anti-Semitism to have better tools at hand.
Thank you. I want to just have a couple of quick follow-up questions, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. Gillian, we heard from Hanif sometimes the dilemma of people recognizing that even if Jews are white, if they are well-to-do, that anti-Semitism is a form of intolerance, of racism, and needs to be confronted, needs to be combated. As you've described a situation, as you said, relatively comfortable one for British Jews when it comes to this problem, perhaps the gray clouds on the horizon have been what we've seen out of the Labour Party in the UK. Here it does seem you have also a reflection of this difficulty in recognizing anti-Semitism for what it is, a virulent form of racism. A party that prides itself on being anti-racist has had difficulty, and we've seen it reflected on the part of Jews who've been active and Jewish students in the Labour Party movement. We're going to see an election only 2 days away. We've seen a party that people were writing off because it seemed to have moved its leadership to the extreme, doing rather well, even though not well at all among Jewish voters in the UK. How are you viewing this aspect of the problem, in other words, inside the Labour Party, and are you bracing if you confront a Labour government, or at least a newly emboldened Labour Party?
Well, as we say, a week's a long time in politics, Andy, so 48 hours is now an eternity. So not long to go till our general election. The clouds haven't been so much on the horizon as in our face. Last year was a very challenging year for us as a Jewish community, as we, and not just us, I might add, wrestled with and confronted the anti-Semitism that was coming from aspects within the Labour Party. And I want to emphasise that, aspects of within the Labour Party. But the fundamental problem is that with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, which of course, and you will recognise this comment, nobody thought was possible. How many times did I say that last year? Many times. But nobody did think it was possible, but actually, when you look back, it was completely possible. Hindsight, a wonderful thing. But with the election of Jeremy Corbyn, those elements, and I again emphasise, the far left, that were on the far left and out of the mainstream, came into the mainstream. That is the problem. And the way I always describe it and feel it is that a space has opened up politically where there is space to say what was previously the unsayable, and whilst we can't monitor the thinking, to think the things that we previously would have thought were unthinkable. And we've all talked about the line about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Now, the upside of all this, because there's always a good thing that comes out of a bad thing, is the profile and awareness of anti-Semitism in Britain has absolutely increased. People understand more what we're talking about, because, of course, it's always been there. It's been there, you know, since the beginning of time. So this is not a new issue. And again, we need to remember that. So actually, it's given us and our issues and what is a reality of visibility, which we have used. We have used it because we have confronted the anti-Semitism from aspects of the Labour Party, the tolerance of it within the Labour Party, whenever and wherever it came from. And we have also been clear, and this is important, that there are the overwhelming number of people in the Labour Party, you know, look at the Labour MPs who clearly stated they didn't support their leader, that they are not of that ilk. And what we have found, so as a Board of Deputies, we run something called an all-party parliamentary group of British Jews. we have found an increasing level of interest amongst Labour MPs who want to join because they want to say, we stand with you. Very important. And the other group that's seen a burgeoning of interest is Labour Friends of Israel. Labour MPs want to say, I want no truck with that anti-Israel sentiment. I want to stand up and be counted. And we have used that. And so in terms of the amount of interest in anti-Semitism, the awareness of it, it has absolutely increased. But there's no hiding. Of course, it's extremely challenging. But our simple line is, whoever's in power, we work with. But equally, it doesn't matter who you are. If you are going down a line that we find unacceptable, we will call you out at every single opportunity.
Thank you, Gillian. Simone, we've recently seen a presidential election in France. At our opening plenary session, we heard from Bernard Henri Lévy how that election saw the defeat of the extreme right candidate, of the extreme left candidate, a new president, Emmanuel Macron. We have seen up till now a French government, in any case, at the highest level, that's been very strongly supportive of the Jewish community, outspoken in condemning anti-Semitism. You've repeated the words of former Prime Minister Manuel Valls of how, essentially, as he said, France without Jews would be unthinkable.
Would not be France.
Would not be France. So what do you anticipate from this new president, and soon there'll be a new parliament to accompany him, and how's the Jewish community in France approaching him?
Thanks, Andy. First of all, overall, I would say that the Jewish community was rather relieved after the elections. The elections really revealed some profound cracks in France's democratic system, and as Bernard-Henri Lévy explained it in the plenary session, indeed, we've had the joy of having not only the far right, but also the far left, and as I explained early on, two very important sources of anti-Semitism. So to have Emmanuel Macron become the president of France, a young, rather centrist candidate, is much of a relief. But there are still many aspects that we don't know about him. We do not know, given that he was never politically elected, he has never held an electoral mandate, that we do not know really what his positions are on a number of issues, including anti-Semitism. We have a few aspects that can give us hints. We at AJC have met with him, we've created a relationship with several members of his team, but nevertheless, in terms of policy, we don't really know. So what are the indicators that we have? First of all, very symbolically, Emmanuel Macron, during the campaign, just 1 week before the elections, went to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. And in a very public manner, I actually accompanied him there. He spent more than 2 hours there. Really made a point on going there, on remembering, and making sure that the aspect of France's history, the fact that France has responsibility in the killing of Jews, was there for everybody to know. So that's one aspect that we do know. We also do know that in a very peculiar way, the only time Emmanuel Macron expressed himself against BDS was in Lebanon. He didn't say it in Israel. He didn't say it in France. He went to Lebanon, and in Lebanon, he said that he was against BDS. France has actually a legal framework that allows to ban BDS, and that he was in favor of keeping the ban of BDS, and he said it in Lebanon. The other thing that we know is that he has met with Jewish communities over the time. When he was Minister of Economy, he went twice to meet with the Jewish community of France. He traveled to Israel when he was Minister of Economy, said that he believed in the strong link between France and Israel, that there were numerous ways and numerous opportunities that existed for him. And lastly, on a personal level, he worked for a bank for a long time. And that bank was Rothschild. So I don't need to go into the details, but obviously that exposed him not only to many Jews who are working within the bank, as well as the Rothschild family as well, but also the perception of the outside world. And he has actually, to some extent, suffered from anti-Semitism. During the campaign itself, a caricature, actually more than one, of him, this banker with the nose and the hands, came out. And so he has actually suffered himself from anti-Semitism. So these are the elements that we have, that he was also, and lastly, he was also part of the government when the government actually put in place a plan to combat anti-Semitism, was Minister of Economy, so not directly responsible for that. But given all of those elements, it can be thought that he will pursue the government's action in combating anti-Semitism, which really over the last couple of years has been very strong. And to some extent has also produced results. The situation is far from perfect, and I think, again, Bernard really has spoken about this. Only a few weeks ago, a woman was killed in France who was Jewish. But from the few elements that we have, we can think that he will go down more or less in the same path as the previous French government.
Okay, thank you, Simone. Hanif, I want to ask you one quick question, and then we'll turn to the audience here. You've described some of the difficulties, real tensions in Sweden, and also in particular when it comes to migrant communities in Sweden. What sort of things are going on? I mean, what is it you can share with us that might give us some hopeful feel for what the future holds?
We're also, I can name one, the winner of the Raoul Wallenberg Award, Siavash Derachti, which is a Muslim Iranian who started a movement, Muslims against anti-Semitism, and has, creating a movement, talking in schools and educating people against anti-Semitism. And the benefit of that system compared to the old system Sweden had, where Swedish politicians and schools, etc., had Holocaust survivors touring and giving lectures. The benefit of Siavash and his movement is that he speaks, the same language and culture and background as these kids, and therefore, kind of connects on a deeper level and is able to mobilize more forces. So that's one positive thing, a movement that we're seeing, but I'm also seeing a bigger media attention being brought after, the classic, denying, covering it up, and now we're seeing kind of, more openness and accepting that this is a problem for Swedish Jews that cannot be denied anymore. But we still see sometimes, there's sharp rises in anti-Semitic attacks, and that statistics gets out, and what the media usually depict it as, they depict it as neo-Nazi crime. And of course there exist neo-Nazi crimes, but there are about 1,000 Nazis in Sweden. There's 20,000 Jews. You cannot affect an entire community in the way that they do not in the broad daylight wear a kippah or a Star of David of only 1,000 persons. Everybody knows this, but therefore sometimes I believe the media depicts the issue wrong. And if you do not have a clear idea of what is the problem, you cannot have a clear solution to address and be able to address the issue. So that's one positive and one negative.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to give people here a chance to ask a question. Matt has a microphone. Let's take a few questions, and then we'll ask our panelists to respond. So, and as you're handing the microphone, I just want to identify someone who's joined us at this session, IHRA Foreman, former U.S. Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. IHRA, stand up. We've always greatly appreciated what you've done. Thank you. wherever that microphone is, let's take a first question.
It's here.
Okay. Esther, please.
Esther from the Netherlands, editor-in-chief of the Dutch Jewish Weekly. My question is for Katharina. Now that we have the working definition on anti-Semitism and most of the EU countries have accepted it, I'm wondering how is it with the figures? Because we have a definition, we can start measuring, for example, anti-Semitic incidents. I know in the Netherlands we have an organization doing that, but could it be possible that Europe will push for institutes in the several countries to really start measuring and writing down what kind of incidents there are, and so on and so forth?
Thank you. Let's take two more, and then we still come back.
Hi, Ken Greenberg from Long Island. Thank you. I'm just, I don't know how to ask this properly, but since you've kind of brought up the three compartments of anti-Semitism, seem to be from the left, the right, at least in France, and the migrant community. And you have, not just in France, but throughout Europe, I call them no-go zones, or places where people have not assimilated or integrated. How do you deal with that, educate that? Because if there are very Sharia-compliant communities, you're going to have a spillover of anti-Semitism.
Okay, let's take another, maybe, Matt, right down there, Kostek Gebert is here with us from Poland.
Konstanty Gebert, Warsaw, Poland. Katharina, I'm delighted to have such a good experience in Warsaw, and I remember with pleasure our conversations. But if you ask somebody from the current right-wing government about why is it that the JCC is so safe, they'll tell you, well, this is because we don't allow any Muslims to enter, and we expect the Jewish community to appreciate. In fact, there are segments of the Jewish community in Poland that do appreciate. The offer is made around Europe from previous extreme rightists, from the Front National through Geert Wilders, on the grounds of assumed explicit or implicit Islamophobia. At the same time, the same government in Poland that says it protects the Jews by not allowing Muslims in refuses to prosecute extreme rightists, Nazis in uniform who demonstrate on the streets, yelling that in the spring Zionists will hang from trees instead of leaves. A question to all of you. In the fight against anti-Semitism, we're usually short of allies. Here we've got this big, burly, muscular ally with a powerful baseball bat in his hands, just willing to join the cause if we give him a pat on the head. What do we do with those putative allies?
Thank you. Well, let's take one more question. Matt, it's your call.
Follow up on the last one. I'm Jonathan Davidson, Chairman of Partners Global. I'm afraid also directed primarily at Katharina. The focus of the discussion has been mainly on Western Europe, understandably, but again, following up, some of the most disturbing trends in the last 5-10 years have been in Poland and other Central and Eastern European countries, especially Slovakia, Hungary. As a former representative myself of the EU and the Commission in Washington, I'm very conscious of the unfashionable fact that the most powerful potential force for democracy and moral values is the EU itself, collectively. Now, developments in those three governments, both in terms of anti-Semitism, but more generally in terms of xenophobia and undemocratic practices, are quite disturbing. And the EU as a whole doesn't seem to be able at the moment to exert its will against those kinds of xenophobic and undemocratic practices. In an earlier time they did against Austria with the rise of Haider's party. Wasn't very satisfactory, the outcome, but it was a statement of moral values which the EU doesn't seem to be able to do in present times. So I'm wondering how much discussion is taking place within the Commission and the EU generally as to what can be done about authoritarian and anti-democratic and xenophobic and discrimination arising in countries like Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary.
Jonathan, thank you. I'm going to now turn to all of the panelists to respond, and then, while the time really will probably be up, I'm sure you can find an opportunity to catch one of them in the hallways after the session is formally over. But Katharina, a couple of questions came to you. Why don't we start with you?
Okay. Yes, thank you. So with regards to data collection, this is indeed something that we are worried about, because in the end you can only fight what you analyze and what you know. We have created with the member states a subgroup which looks into creating a level playing field for data collection across the EU. With regards to the so-called segregation of this data, it's, however, a responsibility of the member states. So, as was said by Simone, whether you separate this data or not is in the end in the power of the member states. One should also not confuse the definition. Can be helpful when discerning what is anti-Semitic, but it is not a legal instrument. We need to use the legal basis in order to make data collection. So I think that is important also to note. And just to make clear, also the adoption was not done by the national governments except for the UK, Austria, and Romania. It was the European Parliament and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that is an internationally recognized organization. So just to be precise on these issues. Yes, with regards to Poland, of course I'm aware, and I out of a matter of time, I didn't go into the issues, but I know there are issues of anti-Semitism, and in fact we see the age-old anti-Semitism in Poland, with which neither the Polish society nor the governments, I would even say, have come to terms with. And this is indeed very worrying, and by the way, also with regards to the Muslim community, because their convictions resonate not only with the left and anti-Israel sentiments, but also with extreme right and Holocaust denial. And I think we have to see the whole picture when we analyze this, and it's very important. I think, and we have seen this also before the various elections recently, how important it is that the Jewish community knows where their allies are. And there have been clear calls from the side of the CRIF against Front National. The Austrian community was clearly against the FPÖ. And so I think it is very important to not confuse, because we have in Germany the AfD demonstrations. People come with Israel flags on the one side, but then have anti-Semitic members as members of party who for example, the head of the Thuringia section said that the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is a disgrace. So, I think the important message is discernment of who the allies are, and work with those, and not be trapped by superficial would-be support. And with regards to the moral responsibility of the EU, I would like to say that there has been clear support with regards, and a clear speaking out, especially by First Vice President Timmermans, but also, for example, the President in his State of the Union speech. to defend our values and to the fact that the values that we have acquired in the post-war periods are not going to stay there automatically, that we need to defend them. And with regards to Poland, for example, there have been certain procedures now with regards to the Constitutional Court, for example, and its role. With Hungary, the situation is a bit more complicated because you know that when the Commission acts, it needs to be on a very clear legal basis and a breach of that legal basis. So while there is a clear political will and also public statements with regards to defending our values, it's much more complicated when it comes to the Commission as the executive body to criticize an individual government of the European Union. This is, however, done, and I think also very vocally, by the European Parliament. And this is why we have a division of power where the Parliament has been quite vocal, and I think it's important to keep to see that balance as well.
Katharina, thank you. We literally have 1 minute for each.
I'm sorry.
Each of you. So, Hanif, last comment.
Yeah, so I can comment on the no-go zone problematics. I mean, you have to distinguish a little bit between the problems of Islamism and the general anti-Semitic. So, I mean, anti-Semitism in these groups have a stronger foothold than Islamism has. I mean, it's more general. Even the street thugs that never put their foot in a mosque, or extreme mosque, even they are anti-Semitic. So that's why. I mean, this is the case for Sweden. I mean, there's these so-called no-go zones differ very much in reasons and composition throughout Europe, but. When we look at the main problem with these regions, of course you have some religious conservatism in these neighborhoods, but mainly it's crime and poverty caused crime that is the biggest security. But that disregard for law and norms creates a perfect breeding ground for somebody to show their anti-Semitism. You can, without punishment or without consequence, harass somebody of Jewish descent, and what are you going to do about it? That's the general sentiment. So that's why Malmö is a big problem, because Malmö, compared to other cities in Sweden, have the neighborhoods very integrated in the city. I mean, it's built in a way where it's not a satellite far away, like in France or Stockholm, Paris. They're in the city, these neighborhoods, and therefore becomes a real problem for the Jewish community in Malmö. While in Stockholm, the city is itself geographically so segregated that the Jews living in central Stockholm can, still with hardships, can live their lives in a normal manner without being so much confronted with these problems.
Thank you. Simone.
I'll keep it very short. Just one thing also to the same issue. There is, what we found in our recent study that we just released in France is that there is a direct correlation between anti-Semitism and the rejection of France's values and France as a state and France as a country. The more the Muslim communities or the individuals that we questioned reject the values of France, reject France as a nation, reject French people, the more you have anti-Semitism. There is a phenomenon of today of creating a Muslim identity versus a French identity, and this Muslim identity is often directly related to the opposition of French values and automatically related to rejection of Jews and Israel. I'll stop.
Thank you. Gillian, last comment?
We also speak very strongly about British values, and for me, British values are very much Jewish values as well. And in tackling Islamist ideology, undoubtedly, we're not just talking, of course, about education and communication, all those things that are extremely important, but we're also talking about tackling the impact of social media, something we haven't, we're just mentioning now, but it is insidious and it has a strength which we cannot ignore. And I also feel, particularly as we speak in this time of terrorist activity, about the absolute need for leadership within the communities that we are speaking of, such that those communities can help to root out and work with the security forces in the way that that needs to happen. So we need very strong leadership from within their community.
Gillian, Simone, Hanif, Katharina, thank you so much. We covered a lot. There's a lot more to do. And thank you for the work. Thank you for the work you're doing every day, not just sharing this morning with us. Thank you all.